Welcome. I'm Tom Burke, and I'm the Associate Dean for Public Health Practice at the school. I'm not Jim Yeager, and Jim's a wonderful colleague of mine, and unfortunately couldn't make it, and we couldn't change the program, but it's much better that you have me here today. And I'm very happy on behalf of Dean Clagg and the school to welcome our students, our visitors, our faculty, and all of those who are watching us on the World Wide Web as we simulcast this. So I'm especially nervous being Jim Yeager right now, so I have to be myself. I know that Dean Clagg has a particular fondness for the breadth of science and the work that the school does, and he calls in his opening remarks often upon the from cell to society work that we do in our broad research initiatives, going from the cellular level, even the subcellular level of science, to the translation of our work to change the world. And hence we have that somewhat embarrassing slogan of saving lives millions at a time. But when it really comes down to it, that's what the Center for Injury Research and Policy is all about. And so as the Dean of Practice, I just wanted to say a few words about the center. As you probably know, it's been 25 years now. And I think we've all been touched by the work of the center. I know we've all been touched. Hopefully not too forcefully by airbags, but the center is particularly important to me because of my colleagues who work there. I'm from the Department of Health Policy and Management, and I recall coming from the world of practice to interview down at Hopkins. And I have to say there are two people who were most influential in convincing me that Johns Hopkins was the place where we actually did go from cell to society, where we took on the tough political issues, and where a practitioner could be part of the research, teaching, and translation. And those people were Sue Baker and Steve Terrett. For a first-time visitor, I'd heard of them. They invented a field and led this field even 21 years ago that was just awe-inspiring to meet with Sue. But what was so amazing, other than how quickly she ran up the stairs to the 4th floor and walked me around, was the passion that the members of the center had, even in the earliest days. And as I looked at the 25-year anniversary brochure and saw the slogan, I also saw something very dear to my heart. So research, education, policy, and practice. I think it's the only center that has practice in the slogan there. That was terrific. So as the Dean of Practice, I just want to say thanks. This is a great celebration of the school's work. The Injury Center is really a crown jewel of the school, but it's now way more than that. It's a worldwide network of experts. It has impacts totally around the world. Our students, others that we have reached out to as this field has developed. And it's just terrific that today we're here to remember Daniel Raskin, to hear from the folks at the center, and to honor the achievements of Joan Claybrook. So once again, on behalf of the school, have a great time, a good meal. But really, I hope that you get to soak up the wonderful atmosphere of achievement and progress as we look forward to the next 25 years and take on those tough issues ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Burke. Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea Gielen, and I have the honor of being the current director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Injury Research and Policy, following in the distinguished footsteps of our department chair, Ellen McKenzie. And it is really just a wonderful day to see all of you here. And I just want to give you a few opening remarks and welcome you to tell you just a little bit about the center. As Tom said, we have a true commitment to the practice community community. Our mission is really to reduce the burden of injury by closing the gap between research and practice. And we have a large multidisciplinary faculty that work every day on research that really makes a difference. And we are very committed to making sure that the results of our research inform policy and programs that can save lives, not just in injury prevention, but violence prevention and trauma care as well. So in addition to sort of our full spectrum research enterprise, we work in close partnership with community partners and the practice community to make the translation happen. And our third area of work is in our commitment to training the next generation of injury prevention leaders. And in addition to the 10 courses that we offer here at the Bloomberg School, we have a week-long summer institute that is open to people from around the country and actually from around the world. And what we have today for you is a seminar series. So every week we offer a seminar on a different topic of injury or violence prevention or acute care. And that's open to the public, and students can take it for credit, and it's one of our ways of trying to reach out and translate what we know into what people can actually use. And while all of our seminars are special, today's seminar is particularly special. We are really honored and delighted to be able to honor Daniel J. Raskin with this memorial symposium, and we welcome his family here today. And we're very excited to use the occasion of our 25th anniversary to honor a real community hero in injury prevention and hear remarks from Joan Claybrook. And we welcome her here as well. And it's also very special because I get to share that activity with our founding director, Susan P. Baker, and our second director, Stephen Terrett. So we are just honored and delighted that you're all here, and we look forward to the remainder of the program. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Baker. Thank you.
If you would, thank you. Thank you very much, Andrea. The symposium today honors Daniel Raskin. Danny was a top-notch investigator for the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB. When he was killed as a volunteer firefighter from a head injury sustained when a hose coupling exploded and the metal part came and struck him fatally. His death was a tragic example of both an occupational injury problem and a product safety defect. These are two areas, occupational injuries and product safety, which are of interest to us, as well as transportation. As a result of this tragedy, Danny's family endowed the symposium where we are today that has helped us to educate members of the Hopkins community, members of the public, about some of the hazards that we face in the world today and what is being done and can be done to reduce those. We would like to thank Danny's family who are here today, his father, Dr. Howard Raskin, his aunt, Dr. Joan Raskin. I'm very happy that you can be here with us. Daniel Raskin was a dedicated human factors analyst for the National Transportation Safety Board. It's a federal agency that investigates transportation disasters and makes recommendations that are designed to prevent not only disasters, but everyday injuries. They play a role in helping to get child passenger protection laws, to get helmet safety laws, and other advocacy efforts that would help to implement their recommendations. The NTSB is governed by a 5-member board. One of the board members, Dr. Mark Rosekind, I believe is on his way here right now. We will welcome him certainly when he gets here. We're also pleased that one of Danny's friends, could join us. Steve Blackstone, who is the NTSB state and local liaison, the NTSB liaison to state and local agencies, worked with Danny both at the NTSB and as a volunteer firefighter. He would like to tell us a little bit about the man that we honor today. Steve?
Thank you. I'm going to just be very brief and offer a brief memory about Danny Raskin, because it really is an honor for me to be here today. I knew him, as Dr. Baker said, both as an employee of the National Transportation Safety Board, but also as a fellow volunteer firefighter. I served as a volunteer with the Bethesda Chevy Chase Rescue Squad in Montgomery County, and he and I quickly developed a bond when he came to the Safety Board because of that common involvement. There's a special bond among firefighters that's difficult to explain and also difficult for those who are not in the fire service to understand. But I think it's one that Danny and I very much shared during our time together at NTSB. We had always talked about wanting to go and ride at one another's station, but somehow it just never seemed to happen because of our busy schedules at the time. But we would often share stories together about the calls that we run and the people we'd come across. Some of them were very funny, some of them were not so funny. But again, it was always talking about how we served the people in our community and how we were able to take care of the challenges that we encountered at fires or accidents or other emergencies. When I think of Danny, my overriding memory of him is that he was full of life. Whenever he would come into a room, he would always fill the room up with livelihood. It would brighten things up immediately. He was the guy who always had a positive way about him. Even if there was something that he wasn't happy about, he still would express that frustration in a positive way. As I said, he always brightened things up when he was around you. He always had a smile or a one-liner or something clever to say about a situation that would just make you smile yourself. People loved being around him at NTSB. And Danny was always the guy who was ready to lend a hand to people whenever they needed something. Even if it wasn't part of his official duties, he would be there to help you with even the most menial of chores or something was perhaps more significant that he'd be called upon to do. He was the guy you could really rely on. Undoubtedly, that was reflected too in the way he served his community in Baltimore County and the people around him there. And I think that word serve is the critical facet of Danny that comes to mind. He was always willing to serve others, whatever situation he was in, both at NTSB and in Baltimore County. So as I say, it was a real honor for me to know Danny, both as a colleague and a friend and as a fellow firefighter. I appreciate very much the Raskin family for sponsoring this event today, and I'm very much looking forward, Joan, to hearing what you have to say later on, and doing so in honor of Danny Raskin.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Steve Terrett, and how often is it that someone gets to introduce a personal hero? I'm very fortunate that I have that job today. I'm also very fortunate that I've known Joan Claybrook for, I think it's 33 years now. She's my hero for many reasons, not just because she gave me my first grant that I've ever gotten in this school, but even though I've known her for all this time, I thought that I ought to do a little bit of research. We are researchers here. I ought to do a little bit of research to make sure that I'm hitting the right highlights for the introduction. So I went to Google last night, and my personal way of finding the most interesting thing on Google is to skip the first bunch of pages. And if you're dealing with someone who is really noteworthy, then going to something like page 30 and seeing what they say in Google. It didn't work for me, but when I got to page 70, it started working for me. There's where I saw a caption that said, "Explaining Joan Claybrook." So I got excited about that because I didn't know that anyone had ever had the ability or the temerity to try to explain Joan Claybrook, but it turned out that that was just some biographical information. I did go to one of the entries that was Joan Claybrook quotations. I liked that one because I saw in one of the quotations that it started with the word malarkey. And yeah, that's Joan. I remember Joan now. So Joan is a native of Baltimore, and she went to Goucher College here. She went after that to Georgetown University Law Center. We should never forget that her success is because she is a lawyer. Joan, in the mid-1960s, with her very close associate Ralph Nader, was instrumental in creating the law in the United States, to which we all owe a great debt of gratitude, because it's the law that keeps us safe when we're traveling on the roadways in the United States. Because of that kind of experience, she was made the administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration during the Jimmy Carter presidential years. She did incredible things, and the thing I think that most people think about when they think about Joan is she's the person, again, for which we all should be extraordinarily grateful. She's the person who gave us airbags in cars by setting off a long history of actually decades of dispute, but setting it off with a regulation telling the car manufacturers in the United States that ultimately they're going to have to put airbags in cars, something that has saved thousands and thousands of lives per year. And we're all grateful, every one of us who travels on the roadways, for doing that. When Joan finished her time at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, she went to Public Citizen, and she continued her interest in safety, and particularly in automotive safety. But her interest is far, far beyond that, and her mark on history goes far, far beyond that. One way that I could explain that to you is I took off of my bookshelf this morning a book called Retreat from Safety, one of Joan's books. And if you just look in the table of contents of that book, let me read you some of the topics the book covers. Infant formulas, food and nutrition, drugs, product safety, the health and safety of workers, environmental protection, transportation safety, and energy. So it would be a discredit to Joan to just think about Joan in airbags or Joan in motor vehicle safety. She certainly is well known, best known for that, but her reach has gone far, far beyond that. We here in the School of Public Health, as public health people, have daily rendezvous with things like molecules in some of our departments, certainly with numbers, the data that we deal with, also for those of us in the Department of Health Policy and Management and others with policy. What we don't have is the kind of things that our colleagues across the street in the School of Medicine have, which is daily encounters, clinical encounters with patients. And I've always thought, and I've said to students in my classes, that those physicians are darned lucky, because they finish whatever they're doing, they come out to the waiting room where the family has been waiting, and they pause. They've been taught how to do that in medical school. built up the tension. They pause and they say, things went extraordinarily well. And the family goes, oh, thank you, doctor, thank you. Can I kiss your golden hands for doing this? Well, what do we get in public health? Again, I mean, we look at data a lot, but even if you think about motor vehicle crashes, so someone has the misfortune of having a frontal or frontal oblique crash with another car or some other object, the airbag deploys, the driver gets out of the car, looks herself over, and notices that she's unscathed, but probably few of them say, thank you, Joan Claybrook, for having saved my life. But she's really owed that. But in lieu of that kind of gratitude, immediate gratitude that other people get, what we've developed in the School of Public Health is awards. We give awards. We give awards to deserving people. And our Center for Injury Research and Policy years ago developed the Community Hero Award. That's given to members of the community and also to programs that have done remarkable things within the field of injury prevention. I can think of no one who is more deserving, who has done more remarkable things for the field of injury prevention than Joan Claybrook. So Joan, if you wouldn't mind coming up, we would like to present you with the Johns Hopkins Center for Injury Research and Policy Community Hero Award. You're just like a rock star. It's hard for you to... And now we all have the pleasure of hearing Joan Claybrook address us on the important topic of the politics of safety. Thank you, Joan.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to come today. It's always a pleasure to be at this school. It's a fabulous, fabulous entity. You're very lucky, all of you who are students here, to be able to come here. I've known many people who've tried to get into this school and haven't. So count your blessings, particularly. And also to the Raskin family, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here to honor your son. And it's very special that you've done this, because a lot of people don't. A lot of families don't. And your son was so obviously an incredible person, and I'm so happy to be able to honor him with everyone else here today. Steve made one mistake in his introduction. He said when my time was finished at NHTSA, I moved on to Public Citizen. I really hadn't finished my time at NHTSA, but Ronald Reagan fired me. And so I had to leave. I was reminded when I first went there, excuse me, that General Motors came in to see me, and they had manufactured some cars with airbags in 1974. Just a few, 10,000 of them. They originally were going to do hundreds of thousands, but then the recession came, and you know car companies always count bucks. And so they sent in this vice president, who's a very charming guy, and I looked at him, and he had just introduced himself. We were sitting down, and I said, do you have an airbag in your car? And his Adam's apple went all the way down here, and it came all the way back up, and he said, yes. And I said, good, because you're going to have more available for your customers very shortly. And so that was the beginning of my time at this fabulous agency called the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which I'm going to refer to as NHTSA. It's much too long to use the whole name. I chose this topic today about the politics of safety freedom from harm versus freedom to harm, because a lot of people don't think about safety as a political issue, but it is absolutely a political issue. And so I will tell you some stories and give you a little framework for why I look at this as a political issue. Safety is very sacred in our society. Obviously, all of you here know that. No one opposes being safe. But what is far less obvious is the skilled opposition to new safety and health standards by the industrial heavyweights, often behind closed doors or behind the moniker of trade associations, so as to avoid tarnishing the image of any particular company. This backroom is where powerful decisions are made and where anti-politics for safety takes its toll. But the need to feel safe is so fundamental. It is so grounded in our basic ethical and our moral beliefs, and even in our brain's basic fight or flight decision matrix, that it's often overridden by the muscular lobbying and opposition by industry, particularly where the public is well informed and on the march. This response to publicly perceived threats has been an impetus for protective new laws from almost the start of the modern conception of government and the administrative state. Just a few examples. In 1906, public outrage over safety concerns was critical to passage of the nation's first federal meat inspection law following public outcry with the publication of a book called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. In the 1930s, it was a key issue that resulted in prohibitions on child labor following media coverage describing many of the children harmed in factories. It was the basis for improvements in drug safety laws following the widely publicized thalidomide scandal in 1960s. It was the underpinning of public demand for removing lead from gasoline that dramatically reduced the number of children that are poisoned by lead for the past 50 years. Public outcry was the force that passed a whole raft of federal bills that improved safety of almost every aspect of our lives as consumers, covering autos and products and toys and water and air and chemicals and coal mining and occupational safety and health and more in the 1960s and 70s, following the publication of two best-selling landmark books that exposed industry practices and motivations, and those were Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962 and Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965. Despite public horror at these notorious scandals, there is a high level of expectation among the public about safety in our everyday lives that unfortunately sometimes is misplaced. There is a perception that government would not allow a product to be sold that was unsafe. Yet, in fact, other than prescription drugs, few products, foods, or other items we consume are actually subject to comprehensive pre-market testing or rules. For just one recent and tragic example, no one expects power windows in cars to strangle their children. Yet, poor design for years allowed windows to suddenly close down as adults as well as children inadvertently pushed down on the lever. You now have to pull the lever up to get the window to close because of federal regulation, and children are no longer strangled in their parents' cars following this $2 fix, but it took years to get it. Most people think that medical devices are carefully regulated, yet many are not well overseen by the Food and Drug Administration, as the whistleblower scandal of last summer showed, with the result that too many patients are killed or injured by defects. Vitamins and other supplements, a billion-dollar industry, are defined as food and are thus not pre-market tested like drugs, yet some can be extremely harmful. In fact, most chemicals we are exposed to every day, as well as others that are highly dangerous and used in the workplace, are unregulated. Indeed, there's no pre-market clearance for thousands of chemicals, including ones that are similar to those we know to be dangerous. Since the passage of the Toxic Substance Control Act in 1975, which requires the government to prove that the chemicals are unsafe, only a handful of harmful chemicals have been analyzed and subjected to any regulation at all. So what are the threads and themes that connect all these subject areas? With this talk, I will outline first a brief history of the fight over safety and safety standards that occurred throughout the last century as America became a mass industrialized society and a globalized one. And secondly, I will present the things I learned as a frontline advocate for safety. Not everything, don't worry. About the capture of government's decisions by industry, the ugly politics of safety and environmental health reforms. The overall framework is both simple and unfortunate. In our capitalistic society, nothing impinges on business enterprise without business involvement, and safety is viewed as an impinging cost by industrial companies. The insurance industry recognized in the 1970s that safety, particularly prevention of injury, results in cost savings. But most companies today still view safety as an expense, excuse me, and not as a benefit to their bottom line. For almost 50 years, there have been ongoing battles between safety and environmental advocates on the one hand and business on the other over what federal and state laws and rules should govern business behavior and the products that are being produced. The most famous adverse reaction to the rising tide of public concern about public health and safety was a memorandum, a very unique memorandum, written in August 23, 1971, by Lewis Powell, who all of you now know was shortly thereafter appointed to the Supreme Court by President Nixon. His memo, written as General Counsel of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, decried the successful attacks on the American economic system, which, he wrote, unlike others in our history, were, quote, broadly based and consistently pursued, gaining momentum and converts, while business was apathetic and responded, if at all, by, quote, appeasement, ineptitude, and ignoring the problem. He was really bawling them out. Powell urged the business community to react and to respond with full force, to assign a vice president of every company the responsibility to organize responses and gather funds to rebut public complaints, to infiltrate educational institutions with funded courses, to demand equal time on the campus, to fund scholarly studies, to engage in media outlets, with media in their outlets, to get politically involved with legislators, to oversee government agencies, with paid and to use paid advertisements, to file lawsuits, and to form a national association of American stockholders with the muscle to be influential. These were just some of Powell's key recommendations to the business community. A major object of Powell's ire was the newly minted activist and corporate critic Ralph Nader, who he called, quote, the single most effective antagonist of American business, unquote. Nader was at the time already a legend and idol to millions of Americans. He began founding small citizen groups to carry forth his ideas, and Powell, in turn, called on the Chamber of Commerce to organize and coordinate his proposals. Powell's memo was a powerful call to arms. Companies reacted by creating the Business Roundtable in 1972, the Cato Institute in 1974, the Pacific Legal Foundation, a litigation group, in 1973, the Manhattan Institute in 1978, the American Council on Science and Health in 1978, the Competitive Enterprise Institute in 1984, with funding from business that is tax deductible as a business expense. They were joined by wealthy heirs to business fortunes like the Scaife and more recently the Koch brothers, who are using their fortunes to circumscribe government activity. The entities or offshoots began to produce business-friendly studies on controversial issues, hold conferences, feed misleading or sometimes biased information to news reporters, hire retired legislators and former government executives, meet with publishers and columnists, debate citizen advocates, push the White House to place business-friendly individuals in key jobs, including the U.S. Supreme Court and the federal courts of appeal, work behind the scenes with conservative business-oriented state legislators through a group called ALEC, which is under some attack right now, testify before Congress, and more. Smaller, more targeted entities were also created as public relations efforts to undermine consumer and environmental organizations on key issues. For example, the Coalition for Vehicle Choice was created and funded by the auto companies and headed by a former NHTSA administrator, one of my successors, to circulate false claims that more fuel-efficient cars would compromise safety. One group, secretly funded by the tobacco company money, State Affairs Company, created a front group, another one called Contributions Watch, to assemble and disclose political contributions by trial lawyers who were viewed as antagonists of industry. State Affairs also attempted to discredit Consumers Union. Industry-funded front groups exploded throughout the 1990s. If you examine business involvement in public policy since the 1970s, you can trace how companies and trade associations religiously followed Powell's prescriptions and expanded on them. It took time, but business influence today on government policy and discourse is almost overwhelming. Powell would be proud of the defense of free enterprise that had been mounted since this memo was published. He would also be amazed at the aggressive activities of today's U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In the mid-1980s, Tom Donahue, the former head of the American Trucking Associations, with whom I've tangled many times, became its president and still is today. He completely changed the chamber from a laid-back association of small businesses to one that actively solicits huge contributions from Fortune 500 companies, fights new federal legislation, opposes important federal regulation, attacks state statutes on product liability and medical malpractice, argues cases in the U.S. Courts of Appeal and the U.S. Supreme Court, and supports others with amicus briefs, raises huge amounts of campaign money to displace progressive elected state Supreme Court justices and state attorneys general, and much more. In fact, they've had an enormous impact on the quality of state Supreme Courts. Donahue made the case to large companies that they should not sully their nameplates by tackling such controversial issues publicly, but should instead let the chamber take the heat and fund them to do the work, and that is what they have done. As business flexed its muscles in the public arena, national citizen groups were formed by Nader and others continuously over the next 20 years, and still today, to push for increased public protections and citizen involvement in government decisions. And such organizations include the Center for Study of Responsive Law, Public Citizen, Common Cause, the Center for Science in the Public Interest, the Center for Auto Safety, Consumers Union and their Washington office, the National Resources Defense Council, the Environmental Defense Fund, the League of Conservation Voters, Greenpeace, Democracy 21, the Campaign Legal Center, Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, the Center for Public Integrity, the Project on Government Accountability, Public Justice, Center for Progressive Reform, and hundreds more. So we were a little bit more prolific than the other side in the numbers of groups. Thousands of them at the state level have sprung up as well. But there is one enduring difference between the business and citizen groups beside their positions on the issues, and that is money. There is simply no comparison between the very modest funding that most citizen groups have and the business-funded organizations with far larger budgets paid for by business dollars. The Nixon administration and subsequent presidents got the corporate message again and again. Nixon was the first to ask the Bureau of the Budget, as it was then called, to evaluate the costs of regulation and set up other White House offices to oversee health, safety, and environmental regulation. That is, they didn't trust the regulators. They moved the control up to the White House. President Carter generally supported his active regulators, I being one, but agreed to passage of the Paperwork Reduction Act, which limited the number of documents that could be requested for companies on the part of the government. President Reagan overtly disliked regulation and set in place executive orders requiring an extensive cost-benefit review by the Office of Management and Budget that continues to the present time. Vice President Bush headed a task force on regulation that was a conduit for corporate positions. In the early 80s and again in 1995, there was a huge push by the business groups to pass a so-called regulatory reform law that was finally defeated by one vote in the United States Senate in 1996. The result of these various forces has been decades-long battles to secure health, safety, and environmental laws and rules. Although most Americans do not realize the extent of this struggle, safety and environmental health are tied up in political decisions from beginning to end, and from the creation of ideas through their implementation and enforcement or lack thereof. As I reflect back on the issues and the power of these forces, I'm sort of amazed at how much has been accomplished in this field. I'm kind of glad I didn't know all this stuff when I started working on it. I might have been intimidated. But when airbags were first proposed in 1969, and I was at the Department of Transportation at this time, I thought it would take a few years to get them into every car. In fact, it took 20 years because of the industry antics and political involvement, starting with a meeting of Henry Ford and Lee Iacocca with President Nixon in 1971, which is recorded as a Watergate tape, so we actually know what was said, through the middle of the Reagan administration and a Supreme Court case. Luckily, the Supreme Court said that the auto industry has engaged in a regulatory war with the airbag, and they have lost in a 9-0 decision. With this background, I next will discuss the two sides of politics of safety. I look first at the factors required to positively influence the adoption of important safety measures, and second, I outline factors that undermine them in terms of legislation, regulation, media and public support, litigation and enforcement, and leadership. First, the determinative role of enabling legislation. And here this is dedicated to Steve, because it's about law. The most important factor in the conception, effectiveness, and enforcement of safety and environmental standards is the underlying law adopted by the Congress. And as all of us who went to law school have heard endless times, read the statute. The statute is your guideline. This is, as they say in business, the bottom line. If a new law is well designed, clear, precise, and comprehensive, those who administer it can be highly effective. But how are laws written and enacted? This is the first area of political engagement between the advocates and the business entities. Enactment of first-class legislation turns on the quality and importance of the ideas being proposed, the determination, skill, and cunning of the staff and the champion member in Congress, and as always, the energy behind it in the form of public support. Within Congress, the seniority of the member authoring the bill, the member's position on the pertinent committee, and acumen in the arcane world of legislative process, relationships with the leadership and other members, including the other party, and their ability to work with citizen advocates and the media are all critical. Quite a task. By and large, strong consumer health, safety, and environmental laws in today's political world have passed when Democrats have been in control of the Congress. However, there are some major exceptions to this, and I have been privileged to work in a bipartisan fashion with members from both parties. For example, the auto safety legislation passed in 2000 in the midst of the Ford Explorer Firestone tire debacle, where the Ford Explorer was turning over and the Firestone tires were exploding, occurred when the House and Senate were controlled by Republicans, as did the 2005 motor vehicle rollover legislation led by Trent Lott, who is both one of the Senate's most conservative legislators and a genius at getting something to the finish line, which is the key to any legislative process. Actually, he said to me after he got that bill through, he came and met me in the hall and said, "Joan, I think you like me better since I passed that bill for you." And he was absolutely right. Both of these bills failed to include some key protections, but much of what I had advocated on behalf of consumers was enacted into law. For another example from my direct experience, when I was lobbying for Public Citizen in 1974, the superior craftsmanship of the original 1966 auto safety regulatory law made it easy to administer and interpret. But it had authorized only defect notification, not defect recall, a requirement added 8 years later, after General Motors refused to voluntarily recall the Corvair for a heater safety defect that allowed carbon monoxide to leak into the occupant compartment, a somewhat horrible type of defect. Representative John Moss, one of the true consumer advocates in the Congress over the years, and actually the author of the Freedom of Information Act, took advantage of General Motors' foolish stubbornness to fix that missing link in the original statute. And so since 1974, they've been required to recall the cars. In the House of Representatives, because the Speaker exercises such strong control over the agenda, the likelihood of passing a controversial regulatory statute today with Republicans in control is minimal if there's any real business opposition. The Senate is more moderate because compromise is often the only way it can act, but any one senator who is opposed to a bill or provision can stop it with just a one-person or a group filibuster. Some statutes contain needless and complex procedural rules, often added at industry request. Delay and procedural review are the hallmarks of industry opposition. They don't say we're opposed to safety. They say, well, it needs this procedural review. For example, for years from the 1960s through the 1980s, members of Congress would attach a congressional veto provision in regulatory statutes, highly politicizing the decisions that are being made by agency heads. Normally the agency head bases it on a docket of information and data and comes to a conclusion. But here, they were going to be required to submit it to Congress for an up or down decision. When I was head of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, we issued the 1977 passive restraint airbag rule, but we had to send it to Congress for a vote on it before it could become effective. Nothing could be more political. I worked for weeks to get support from the Congress. Luckily, we got it past the Commerce Committee in the House by only 2 votes, and that sealed the deal. This congressional veto provision, though, was so popular with members of Congress that it got inserted in over 200 bills, making thousands of proposed regulations potentially subject to this crass political decision-making. And of course, this influenced the content of the rules that were issued. They often were less strong or effective to avoid causing political opposition. The only remedy, in our view, was to turn to the courts for a challenge under the separation of powers portion of the Constitution. Several such cases were brought by Public Citizen when I was in charge. And in 1983, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the one-house congressional veto unconstitutional in a case called INS, the Immigration Service, versus Chadha, thus decreasing somewhat the political nature of regulatory decisions. But this decision made these provisions in hundreds of regulatory statutes a dead letter, although, count on the business community to come back. Today, a newer version called the Congressional Review Act provides a constitutional mechanism under which both houses of Congress must weigh in on a rule once it is completed by the executive branch to send it back to the agency for possibly send it back to the agency for further consideration. These examples show how complex and difficult it is to pass health, safety, and environmental statutes that are strong and will result in new public protections. Even when we do succeed, legislation has also been used, of course, to undercut important public programs. This has occurred with amendments to pending legislation on the topic, to riders on annual appropriations bills, to provisions stuck in the end of the year wrap-up legislation or during the rush to adjourn. This is why there's a dire need for citizen groups who are skilled and knowledgeable about legislation to organize in support of needed protections and to help block legislative attacks on these important safety programs. Secondly, regulatory flights slow death by detail. Issuing new regulations is far more obscure than passing a law. Watchdogs must keep track of the Federal Register each day to know when a proposed or final rule is issued, and most agencies allow only 60 to 90 days for comment. So if you miss it and then you learn about it later, you may never get your comments filed. Comments to agency dockets on proposed rules often run 20 to 50 pages with many citations and footnotes. To have an impact, commenters must know the topic, have researched the underpinnings of the agency proposal, and supply new information, not just stake out a position. Usually the most knowledgeable comments come from those involved in the industry, but these are rarely favorable to the new health, safety, or environmental rule. Citizen groups that closely follow the agency rulemaking can have a strong impact on the agency's decision, but it's a full-time job. Generally, health, safety, and environmental rules require significant scientific research to substantiate the proposed rule. Sometimes this research takes years, and it is costly, yet it is often underfunded, hurting the agency's capacity to even issue a rule. In addition, an agency must develop information on the benefits and costs of a particular proposal. If the rule proposes a performance standard, the methods used by the companies to comply can vary widely. That is not just saying that you have to put an airbag in the car, but it says if you crash the car into a wall at 30 miles an hour, the instrumented dummy must perform in a certain manner. That's a performance standard, making cost and benefit data far more complex. Rarely do agencies have all the information needed to show the benefits of a rule, and industry regularly exaggerates the costs, which the agency must then evaluate. These deficiencies affect the outcome of the rule because it could possibly be stronger if there was sufficient data to justify it. Industry lobbyists also regularly lobby the appropriations committees in Congress that allocate dollars for agency research and testing. With this starve the beast strategy, it's unsurprising that all of the health and safety regulatory agencies are grossly underfunded. Just think of the Defense Department. All of the agencies that I've talked about here are a footnote in the Defense Department budget. And yet if you look at what kills most members of the military, it's auto crashes. A point that I try to make to them with some frequency, but they still don't give us any grants. Industry lobbyists also follow an attempt to shape agency research like hawks to discern what a proposed rule might look like. Their tentacles reach deep into the regulatory agencies. Companies conduct their own research and meet with agency officials to discuss what they're pursuing, hoping to get insights into agency thinking. And top agency staff are invited regularly to visit the company headquarters for briefings and discussions. Sometimes government and industry even share testing facilities. For example, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration rents space at Honda's Ohio research facility that is used also by most of the auto companies, and they end up using some of the same technicians to help them with the testing. It's an obvious conflict of interest, but the agency refuses to address it, not wanting to upset either the Ohio politicians or Honda, and doesn't have the capacity to get more money from the appropriations committees to build their own. Or at least that's what they say. I don't believe it. Industry often connects with contractors hired by an agency to carry out its research. In fact, many times, contractors working for both the industry and government are on the same subject. A pending study of large commercial trucks at the Department of Transportation is under attack from truck crash victims because the agency wants to use regular industry contractors to guide the study on whether to increase truck size and weight. Truck safety is one of my favorite issues, by the way. So, I've been pounding down the doors of the Department of Transportation on this issue. Company researchers are also intimately involved in technical societies with agency scientists. They encourage government technical meetings at which scientists from both industry and government can network and can make presentations. More lucrative private sector jobs are often a destination following government service, and many private sector people take a turn through the government to increase their credibility, harnessing the power of the revolving door. Government agencies are pushed, often through legislation, to create advisory committees on which companies' officials serve, giving them unique access to agency thinking and a unique position from which to ask questions and request information. Usually these advisory committees are dominated by interested industries with only a few citizen representatives, as with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration Advisory Committee. From a public perspective, these committees are of little value in enhancing the agency's work and are often a waste of precious resources. Transparency is and remains an important tool, though sometimes its promise remains unfulfilled. Government agencies must abide by openness rules in rulemaking, and all comments to rules are placed in an online public docket. Agency officials are prohibited from commenting publicly on the content or direction of pending proposals, but agencies are also required to put into public dockets all documentation excuse me, of research relied on for the rulemaking and all written comments concerning the proposed rule. Yet in practice, these rules do not result in enough accountability. An agency official who discusses a proposed rule with an outside party or even a representative of another agency must file an ex parte communication to the public docket so that all parties are aware of the communication. But these memos are rarely comprehensive or useful because they are written vaguely and are often filed weeks or even months after a meeting. When the airbag rule was being upgraded in 2000, a key industry agency meeting was not documented until just before a new second proposed rule was issued. The new proposal cut back the test for unbelted occupants from a very significant 5 miles an hour, which is what the companies recommended to the agency in the meeting. But the delay in following the ex parte minutes made it too late for citizen groups to dispute the industry rationale before the new proposal was published and on its way. There are other players in regulatory decision-making that are far less transparent. If an agency is located in a large department like HHS or DOT, the secretary or the secretary's top staff of that department reviews a proposed rule or a final rule before it's published, as does the Office of Regulatory Review and Analysis in the OMB. That was created by President Reagan, an arm of the White House. Here all the public protections disappear as the agency operates in secret and is known to be sympathetic to industry requests and arguments. And even the Freedom of Information Act allows interagency deliberations to be held secret. For just one example, OIRA's disagreement with DOT on the hours of service rule for truck drivers resulted in a do-nothing rule being issued. Yet tired truckers are one of the primary causes of truck crashes resulting in death and injury to car occupants. While OIRA, this OMB office, is staffed with civil servants, their primary training is in economics and numbers, rarely in science. They use cost and benefit analysis as a cudgel to block, dismantle, or delay rules the industry opposes. They meet with outside groups, including industry, and will often require the regulatory agency to respond to questions and issues raised by the companies, which they couldn't get answers for before, and ones that probably the agency should not have to disclose. Through this office and pressure from Capitol Hill are where the politics specifically intervenes with the scientific regulatory system. A tactic companies use to avoid regulation where an agency is not required to act but rather has discretion, and that's the norm, is to urge adoption of voluntary standards or state action or merely consumer education in lieu of agency regulatory action. These substitutions are usually a totally inadequate remedy to the public harm that is being addressed. Voluntary standards are set by industry in its own self-interest, are obscure, are not developed in public, may or may not be a remedy to a particular problem, may or may not be met by any particular company, as there is no enforcement. By the same token, state action usually does not fully address a product safety problem. States typically have little authority to regulate products. They can require changes in personal behavior, seatbelt use laws, limits on drinking and driving, motorcycle helmet use, restrictions on the use of electronic equipment while driving, limits on speeding, and so on. And these restrictions can make a huge difference if effectively enforced, but they are rarely an adequate substitute for a federal product rule. For example, even seatbelt use laws, as important as they are, and they have been very important, do not protect the occupant's head and chest in a crash as does an airbag. Further, no federal regulatory agency has authority to require the state to act. Only the Congress can do that, and it is generally limited to giving states money or withholding it in order to get the laws passed. So thus there is a lack of consistency between state laws across the country. Consumer information can make a difference, but only if it's readily available at the moment of a consumer's decision to purchase. One program at NHTSA has been a great boon to our efforts, has been the New Car Assessment Program, which was started during my tenure, under which new cars are annually crash tested and the performance evaluations are publicly released. The 2005 legislation, with the leadership of former Senator DeWine, a Republican of Ohio, requires that a new car price sticker also include these crash test ratings, so the new car buyer is informed about safety right at the moment of purchase. This program has encouraged auto companies to compete on safety performance and also to sell safety of their vehicles by referencing these crash tests or hiding them and not mentioning them. Another factor influencing the regulatory process is the diversity of sources for technological innovation in a marketplace. Regulation sparks innovation as the best companies see an opening for a new market. For years, the major automotive companies controlled most innovation, and auto suppliers would not even talk to members of Congress or regulators or citizen groups about their innovations for fear of being punished by the manufacturers who were buying their products. But in the last 20 years, with more competition, suppliers have pushed their new products, giving regulators the opportunity to expand their regulatory decisions, and they've also been emboldened and now take pride in boasting about their new ideas. The electronic stability control systems on relatively new cars is a good example. As rollover crashes became a leading source of death and injury, in motor vehicle crashes, Volvo, one of the smallest auto manufacturers, took the lead in designing a new SUV called the XC90 that was lower to the ground and contained electronic stability control developed by a supplier company. Shortly after this product was produced, the Congress, in 2005 legislation, decided it would require NHTSA to issue a rollover prevention standard. And within record time, a new stability control rule was issued with full compliance in September 2011. Its payoff is remarkable. This supplier made a point of educating all interested parties about this innovation, and it made a difference. There are a few independent federal agencies that play a strong role in the regulatory process through their investigations and reports, such as the National Transportation Safety Board, where Danny worked, that investigates crashes and makes recommendations, usually strong ones, for legislative and regulatory changes. It did this again and again on the motor coach safety issue. Its work was instrumental in persuading Congress just this last summer to pass a strong law for motor coach safety in 2012. The Government Accountability Office and Auditing and Evaluation Arm of the Congress and the Inspector Generals in each government department also play a strong role in pushing for safety improvements, and citizen groups recognize this and are regularly in touch with these independent offices. In sum, companies keep close tabs on regulators to influence the outcome of agency decision-making, to avoid surprises, to see a marketplace advantage, and to be prepared to dispute agency decisions. They use a wide variety of tactics, including support or interference from Congress and the upper levels of the White House to do their job. Citizen organizations also work closely with members of Congress on accountability, and in particular often try to get deadlines for issuance of a particular safety, health, or environmental rule written into the law to hold regulators' feet to the fire, to assure continuity on when there are changes of leadership, and to secure the opportunity to sue an agency if it delays issuance, as is too often the case. I'll get into that more in a minute, more of Steve Terrett. Media and public support the critical accountability for Congress and the agencies. It's my third topic. Citizen groups specialize in encouraging media coverage of health safety issues, and even in today's reduced print media marketplace, we successfully get attention to controversial problems. This is really essential. It informs the public, it alerts members of Congress, it builds public support, and lets regulators know we're watching. But media is especially important because public decision makers, like members of Congress and agency heads, are acutely aware of possible backlash if their decisions are unpopular. Once an issue grabs public attention, the press cannot get enough information or interesting stories. The Firestone Tire Ford Explorer defect story was first revealed by two television programs on a local Houston television station in early 2000. We brought it to the attention of NHTSA. The agency made inquiries to Ford and Firestone. They denied and delayed, as usual. But a few months later, a reporter discovered that Firestone had recalled some of these tires in Saudi Arabia, not in the United States, and the issue blew. Ford forced Firestone, who supplied the new car tires, to conduct a recall of some of them in order to save the reputation of one of its best-selling vehicles, the Explorer. This occurred in August when nothing was happening in Washington. That was pure luck. And the press covered it every day on television and in print. We encouraged Congress to hold hearings, and when they did, we testified recommending legislation to increase NHTSA's authority in the defect area and also in rollover. This legislation passed in 2 months in record time, just before Congress adjourned late in that year. Sometimes labeling things in public makes a difference. To counter the cover provided by trade associations, one big truck bill supported by the snack food industry, among others, we publicly named it the Frito-Lay bill. And the press followed suit, which drove the company crazy. And that's one of the things we try to do. Citizen advocates also regularly form coalitions with a broad range of national and regional groups to counterbalance the power industry wields with its economic control, its jobs, dealers, suppliers in almost every section of the country. Trade associations, of course, campaign contributions. Can't leave without mentioning those. Our coalitions include nonprofit health, safety, consumer, environmental, police, and firefighters. We often work with firefighters who are on the front line of many of these issues. Sometimes certain businesses join in, especially in the insurance sector, or separately support the issue. And we sometimes represent as many as tens of millions of Americans in our advocacy. We also bring victims of harmful products to Washington to speak out about how they were harmed and to put a human face on the problem. And I can tell you that no member of Congress wants to meet a person who's been injured in one of these tragedies and speak to them and say, no, I'm not going to vote for this bill. Abstractions don't tell the story nearly as well as people who have suffered deeply. And these people are authentic, they're articulate, and they're passionate about both the terrible harm they have suffered and the demands for rational solutions. They connect the product design or public policy with the human impact as nothing else can do. Where possible, we also surprise the media and government decision makers with inside information or analyses that have not been considered. We regularly file Freedom of Information Act requests to get details we would not otherwise know. In the battle over federal rules for the bus industry, we figured out that the cost of all new safety standards we wanted mandated, which are a dozen or so, would cost only 10 cents a passenger. People were shocked. The industry had been saying it cost, billions of dollars. When the costs are spread over such a large volume of, the industry carries over 700 million passengers a year. And so when the costs are spread over such a large volume, the costs per person are very small. This infuriated the motor carrier trade group, but it worked. And the bill was amended down somewhat, but it became law, carrying out many of the National Transportation Safety recommendations. When battling to stop a special exemption for 97,000-pound tractor-trailer trucks in Maine and Vermont, the federal rule is 80,000 pounds. So this was a huge increase. We filed FOIAs in Maine and Vermont and learned about collusion of the trucking industry with state officials when they lobbied Congress. We also got our hands on a study by the Federal Highway Administration, which they had withheld despite our FOIA request, showing that a pilot project in those two states with heavier trucks increased death and injury. We eventually lost this battle because the White House wanted the votes of the two Maine senators for another issue and would not oppose the heavier weight truck exemption. We saw politics in the raw in this particular case. Safety was totally sacrificed. At this point, media about safety issues could not change the outcome. Public sentiment generally favors the work of citizen groups trying to get greater protections from government regulators. Every public opinion poll since the early 1980s shows that the public gets it. They want strong government protections for toxic chemicals, for motor vehicles, for drugs and medical devices, for clean air and drinking water. For stopping bigger trucks, public support is off the charts. which is very important for safety advocates, given the power of the trucking industry and its huge campaign contributions. They hate the fact that we exist because we drive this point home all the time to members of Congress and to regulators. Business regularly attempts to thwart our access to key information with requests to government agencies for confidentiality of the information they've supplied, business information, even when it is not warranted. Government agencies really do not want to deal with such disputes, and they don't want to be sued by the business over access to claimed confidential information, so they usually just agree that it's confidential. It is then the job of the citizen advocates to find this out and to challenge the decision. Government agencies routinely keep important data and information secret, even with presidential claims of openness in their administrations. Individuals must file FOIA requests, which sometimes take months, sometimes years to get answered. The internet has helped, but much more information remains concealed. In legislation in 2000, the Congress required NHTSA to secure early warning information from companies about possible safety defects. The companies would have to report this information to the agency if there was a death or injury in any make or model. There was a colloquy on the floor of the House with the committee chair saying this information would be public. The president in his signing statement said it would be public. The top agency lawyer wrote a memo saying it would be public. But guess what? After George Bush was elected, it was kept secret. Even after extensive litigation by public citizen, only some of it is released. None of this should be necessary. The public has a right to know which vehicles are potentially dangerous. Among other benefits, it encourages citizens to report problems about these vehicles and help the agency in its investigations. Fourth, litigation and enforcement, the teeth of the law. Citizen groups and industry regularly sue government regulatory agencies for failure to obey congressional directives, for not acting in a timely manner, for being arbitrary and capricious in making a decision not supported by the public record, for violating the Constitution, and for not enforcing the law. These are very difficult suits to win because the courts are disposed to support government agencies and give them discretion in making such decisions. Our strongest cases involve the failure to obey legislative mandates and directives. That's why that legislation part was so important. This is the reason citizen groups attempt to secure legislation to include mandates and specific dates by which the agency must act. The most important cases are challenges to an agency's refusal or failure to enforce the law. The courts give agencies wide discretion in this area to decide how to allocate their enforcement resources. Winning a lawsuit against a government agency is a powerful tool. Agencies hate to be overridden by the courts, and if they do lose, the agency must redesign and reissue the rule in a way that they previously resisted. Agencies are stubborn about this. Here's a great example. Truck safety advocates sued the Department of Transportation in 2002 for its failure to issue a new mandatory rule on truck driver hours of service. In 2003, we won. DOT then issued a rule, and we sued them again, this time because of its clear inadequacy. In 2005, we won the case in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Despite our victory, DOT reissued virtually the same rule again. We sued again, and in 2007, we won again. Then DOT issued the rule again with a small but insignificant changes. We sued yet again, and then President Obama was elected. The new administration asked us to hold the case in abeyance while it considered a new rule. We agreed, and we waited. DOT finally issued a new rule with only a few changes. We had to sue again, making the story a decade-long adventure over one single rule. This, in short, tells us the story of the power of the trucking industry. Only the courts are immune from their reach, but even they are clearly tired of this case coming back again and again. We have whittled it down, but not enough. In addition, the government agencies occasionally sue companies they regulate for failure to obey the law, for refusal to take corrective action, for delay in recalling an unsafe product. The Toyota case was a good example where they had runaway Toyotas and Toyota kept it secret, and they got fined some $30 million, for lying to the government, for withholding information required to be submitted, and so on. There are several problems with the reality of this enforcement authority. First, penalties for violating the law, even egregiously, are generally tiny when compared with the cost of business. For example, we fought to get the maximum penalty from NHTSA that they could impose up from $1 million, a maximum of $1 million in the year 2000, to $15 million. We had asked for $75 million, but Congress didn't give it to us. In the last few years, we tried again in a new bill, recommending $250 million, and this passed the Senate, but was cut down by the House of Representatives to $35 million. which is still chicken feed for these multinational corporations. Second, most safety and environmental regulatory agencies do not have criminal enforcement authority, which is what really gets the attention of companies contemplating law violations. In fact, criminal penalties are the great deterrent, even if they're never used. Third, most agencies have very limited budgets and only a small legal office that is primarily concerned with regulatory process, not litigation. Fourth, the Justice Department controls most government litigation and decides whether you can sue or not. When I was NHTSA administrator, I asked the Justice Department to sue Firestone Tire, this is for an earlier defect, for covering up a massive radial tire defect involving 20 million tires. The Justice Department refused on the basis, they said, that by the time the case was over, the offending tires would be worn out. Well, that was hardly the point. A lawsuit would have forced Firestone to do a recall long before we ever went to court. I decided not to tell anybody. I never told anybody until this moment in time. And about that call, and thus we negotiated with Firestone for several months while the press was banging away at them and key members of Congress were hovering around, finally persuading Firestone to recall the tires. Private litigation by people harmed by products also plays a role in the regulatory agency decisions. Such private litigation can be instrumental in discovering information about the source of a defect, what caused the harm, about alternative remedies for correction of the problem, and it reflects what is happening in the real world, in the current marketplace, in a way that government officials often don't know. Government officials are generally very arrogant about paying any attention to private attorneys or even looking at the information they gather. Many such private attorneys are so overworked they don't want to get involved with the bureaucracy of an agency, and others take the position they prefer the agency not look at their case because if the agency disagrees, it could hurt their case in court. We have been intermediaries with private litigants and government agencies on some occasions, and it is clear that they should work cooperatively as each can help the other, but it rarely happens. Nonetheless, private lawsuits can create a public focus on a problem that helps put the spotlight on the media and the Congress and the agencies, as happened with the Firestone Ford Explorer cases. Of course, business knows all this and has developed shrewd tactics to block private liability suits. Business puts a preemption clause in its consumer contracts for bank accounts, for investment services, for cars, and so on. That requires the pursuit of any remedy to be in private arbitration and not in our public courts. This is costly to consumers, is secretive. The outcome does not set a precedent for a future case. It can block class action cases, and worst of all, consumers lose most of the time because arbitrators want to be rehired, and defendant companies blackball the ones who fine for consumers too frequently. This is all in the private marketplace. Finally, leadership, the critical vacuum in corporations and government. It may be too obvious, but the likelihood that serious harms will be effectively addressed by government rests heavily on the leadership of health, safety, and environmental regulatory agencies. Too often, even well-intentioned leaders lack awareness of how strong they must be in the face of pressure from industry, from politicians, from the White House, and affected citizens and citizen groups. I got a call when I became NHTSA administrator within a couple of months of my coming there, and it was a call from the White House, and I was told that they wanted me to come over and talk to them because Henry Ford was opposed to some of the things I was doing. And I said to them, well, if I come over, you know I'm going to have to put this in the public docket. And so I was with regard to a particular rule. And I said, now, if you want this in the public docket, and if Henry Ford wants this in the public docket, that's fine with me. I'll be happy to meet with you. But if you don't, I'd suggest we end the phone call now. And they never called back. Now, that is the role of the regulator. You have an enormous amount of authority and control, but you have to exercise it. If companies find weaknesses in their inevitable early test of an administrator's leadership, they will find ways to take advantage of it. Other issues include the revolving door from industry to industry. This is particularly likely with higher level agency officials, and Lou Lombardo, who's come here with me, has been documenting the revolving door at NHTSA, which is lengthy. Also, most agency administrators stay in the job less than 4 years. I'll say Jimmy Carter made us all sign a document saying we would stay for 4 years, which I thought was a very shrewd thing he did, causing difficult transitions in the appointment of individuals who are acting for short periods. There's also the issue of conflicts of interest, which should cause officials to recuse themselves from decisions. For example, the Deputy Federal Highway Administrator, the one in office right now, a guy named Gregory Nadeau, worked for the Maine DOT and pushed for bigger trucks. At the federal DOT, he now intends to participate in a major study that Congress has requested on big trucks, on whether or not to allow them to get bigger, and wants to hire a number of contractors who have worked for the trucking industry. We view this as a gross conflict of interest and recently asked the Deputy Secretary to require his recusal on this issue. It takes intense knowledge of the circumstances and prior work history of individuals to be able to make such a request, and too often outsiders don't know that these even exist. Anyone who doesn't think regulation is fundamentally political did not hear the president's debate last week, the presidential candidate's debate last week, or read Nicholas Kristof's column entitled "The Cancer Lobby" in the New York Times on Sunday. Kristof hit the nail on the head when he asked, who knew that carcinogens had their own lobby in Washington? He explains that the American Chemical Council is trying to cut off funding in Congress for the 500-page consensus, quote, report on carcinogens, quote, that's published every 2 years by the National Institutes of Health, because, among other things, it now lists formaldehyde as causing cancer. So they want to kill the entire project. Of course, public health officials such as your own Dr. Sue Baker and Steve Terrett have taken on massive industries and have been enormously important in many of the decisions that the government has made. Dr. Baker's work on auto safety and small plane safety and teen drivers and so on has had huge impact. She's quite stubborn, but a great ally. I remember once when she got mad at DOT for abandoning airbags and while saying that people should wear their belts. So she came over to DOT and she stood outside the parking garage as employees left work to document how few of them were actually wearing their belts, and then she submitted it to NHTSA's rulemaking docket. To learn about small plane safety, she told me, I think this is true, that she got her pilot's license when she was not so young, in the course of which she had a death-defying experience. While she was trying to land, she could not get the flaps down. I can't remember the rest of the story, but she's here today, so it's all well. And Steve Terrett, of course, was on NHTSA's back when I was administrator in the 1970s, and as an attorney, he was particularly interested in auto safety and product liability, and I'm delighted to hear that there's now going to have a course here in the law at this school, because it is an integral part of, as you can hear from what I've had to say, of much of the decision making. And his work on gun safety is legend. I mean, he caused so many problems with that, we won't even go into it. And the public health officials have been key to many health and safety issues, including, of course, tobacco control. And they are essential supporters of scientific as opposed to political decision making. I firmly believe that companies can excel at protecting the public health and safety and still make a profit. It's just a matter of leadership. Still, the battle for safety, health, and sound decisions never ends, which is why the Johns Hopkins School, a Bloomberg School of Public Health, training of the next generation of public health officials is so important. We need your help in these fights for the public good over the self-interest of the bottom line. And the leaders of both government and industry must take on the important task of figuring out how to ensure the government puts public health and safety first and foremost. We must continue to insist that public officials say that public health trumps industry's narrow-minded view of their ethical obligations to society. It's been a privilege to be here. It's 1:30. There's no time for questions. Well, as you can see, I'm so enthusiastic about the topic that I talked too long, and I don't know if there's any time for questions or not.
It wasn't too long at all. It was wonderful. Thank you very much. It was terrific. I think we have time for one question. It's not quite 1:30.
Okay.
Any burning questions? Anybody? Anyone? Okay. Well,
I should acknowledge our friends from the National Transportation Safety Board. They're here, and thank you so much for coming.
Yes. Thank you all for coming. It's been just a wonderful symposium, and thank you. Grab some dessert on the way out if you'd like, and we'll see you again at another seminar, we hope. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Jen.